afternoon, everybody, and welcome to today's Better Managers Briefing. I'm Anne Farnsworth, the Chief Executive of the Chartered Management Institute, and every Friday at this time, we try to bring you news and topics of interest in these troubling times. Today, I'm delighted to speak with two companions on a topic that is extremely important, which is how much can you count on COVID stimulating your interest in purpose and in ESG? And I'm delighted to welcome Sarah Gordon, who is the CEO of the Impact Investing Institute. And prior to that, she was the business editor of the Financial Times. And Brenda Trenowden CBE, who is now a partner at PwC's People Practice and is the past global chair of the 30% Club. So welcome to you both. Delighted to see you. And first question. A lot of us hope that companies will take purpose and ESG, or environmental, social, and governance criteria more seriously coming out of this crisis. Do you agree? And do you think the pandemic strengthens the business case for making these factors an integral part of the recovery? And how widely is that understood? Let me start with you, Sarah.
I think someone recently said something fantastic to me, which is that everyone's vision of the post-pandemic world is the world they most wanted to see before the pandemic. So they find all the reasons in this current situation for the world post-pandemic looking more like what they wanted the world to be. And so I think there is a bit of a danger of being over-optimistic about the impact of the pandemic. Nevertheless, I think that what it has done is really, it's put a lot of us who weren't previously in that position absolutely front and center with some of the really big issues of our time, particularly things like the climate emergency, the lack of equality across the globe, some of the issues that have really made the impact of the pandemic so much more destructive. You know, people who don't have access to affordable healthcare, people who don't have access to decent jobs, to decent shelter, to running water, clean running water to drink or wash their hands. And I think it's made it so clear that the way that has made the pandemic so much worse. And at the same time, I think we've seen in response to the pandemic such incredible importance of community and of joint action and of positive collaboration, that I think that's really reinforced the message that, you know, we all need to collaborate to produce a more sustainable world. And I think just finally on that, I think we believed before the pandemic that to deliver genuinely sustainable profit streams in the future, you need to be a genuinely sustainable business. And that means taking account of the environment you operate in, the way you look after your supply chain, the way you behave towards your employees. And honestly, I think the pandemic has made that even clearer, both to the general public, but also in boardrooms up and down the country.
Well, let's hope so. Brenda, what are your thoughts on this?
Well, I think although Sarah started with a very cautious note, and she does always keep us grounded, she ended on a very positive one. And I think that, yes, definitely we will see people take this much more seriously. I've never heard people talk about purpose as much as they have throughout the pandemic. And clearly, there are some businesses that may just be saying it and don't actually feel it. But I think the spotlight on business leaders and on businesses has never been stronger. And, I'm hearing people talk a lot more about well-being, about mental health. Some leaders saying, that they want to think about their people first and then their customers, and really being very authentic in how they're communicating with their staff. I think people that have been grounded in purpose have found that really helpful in terms of making tough decisions that they're having to make, in the short term. Maybe it's repurposing their manufacturing for COVID related things or changing payment holidays and things. But in the long term, some of those big, tough decisions that will really impact how they're viewed after the crisis. So, I'm quite encouraged, I think, by this sense of broader stakeholders, and as Sarah mentioned, community, people realizing that they are part of communities and that we have to work together. And this is a big, crunchy, global, complex issue that really goes beyond just short-term profits, and really making people rethink how they want to interact with society, with their staff, with their investors, and the communities in which they're operating in. So I'm quite hopeful that that this has really brought this much more to the fore.
Well, I think we're all very hopeful, but there's hope and then there's delivery. So, Brenda, if I can ask you, how do we get companies to get more serious about this and to actually do things as opposed to simply virtue signal? What's your
Sure.
advice?
So that's a really good question, and I think, you know, bringing it to life is the absolute crux of it, because it's all well and good to have a very high-minded purpose and something that's quite ambiguous and sounds great, but the question is do your staff actually feel the difference, you know, about having a purpose? How does it change how they operate, how they feel in the company, and how they take decisions? So I have a couple of clients that we've been talking to about this, who've been really thinking about how they take this and embed it throughout their organization. So if you're a bank, you know, does it affect your credit decisions? You know, do you think about who you want to lend to, what type of businesses you want to finance, you know, and how is that grounded in your purpose? Do you think about how you treat your staff in your purpose, you know, not just when it's a crisis, but from day to day? And can you bring to life and can you align with individuals their own sense of purpose with your corporate sense of purpose? And for many businesses, they've got very different aspects of their business. They may be in different countries. So I think allowing different units to interpret purpose and to bring it to life in their own areas, but actually spending the time and realizing that this is actually a business and strategic issue. You know, purpose isn't CSR that sits in the corner and we'll bring it up at the end of the meeting if we have time because it would be nice. You know, the businesses I think that are quite successful in this very much align purpose with strategy and think of it, you know, about why do we exist? Who are we here to serve as customers? How do we want to do it? And they very much then, you know, think about their values and the culture and tie that all together. And that really leads to much more sustainable, you know, long-term businesses. So it's not about making it your marketing statement. And I think the businesses that virtue signal or that put these statements out with nothing behind it, it actually creates a lot of backlash. And if you look at in COVID, how businesses have responded, those that have tried to suddenly create purpose and talk about it before doing anything, I think, you know, I'm not going to mention any names, but I think we can all think of some names, you know, in that regard. And I think it's really going to hurt their brands and it's going to hurt, you know, their ability to attract talent. So I would say if you had purpose already, then, you know, really bringing it to life and talking about it and making it real for your staff, it's a very, very compelling and competitive business advantage, from, you know, who you employ and how you employ, employee engagement, to customer loyalty, to looking at your investors, especially people who are focused on ESG. And those who haven't had purpose and are maybe just thinking about it now, get on with it, work on it, and act on it first before talking about it.
So that's all great advice, and your message is clear. It's got to be an essential part of the business plan and not a bolt-on. But of course, you mentioned investors, and they're a vital part of this. So Sarah, turning to you, what can investors, regulators, governments do to make it easier for companies to follow these principles? And what are the enablers that we need?
I mean, just first of all, echoing what, sort of amplifying maybe what Brenda was saying about the need to embed purpose at the heart of the operational model. I mean, I think there are a number of companies and advisors that can really help on that. And I mean, we've worked with a fantastic organisation called Blueprint for a Better Business, and their experience, they've been talking about purpose to businesses for a number of years. And one of the things that they say that I found really insightful is that this is about really a lot of conversations and deep thought at the CEO and senior executive leadership and board level, first of all, that you really need to think about this and talk about this in a very open and trusted way. And that's the first stage, before then the sort of operational consequences of that conversation, you then implement those. And I think, we've seen this very much with something like, the pandemic's not the only huge thing that's been going on at the moment, of course. I mean, with the Black Lives Matter protests, I think one of the things that's been very important is for organisations to really sound authentic, to be authentic as well as sound authentic in their response to these incredibly legitimate and justified protests. You've needed to look inwards as much as outwards, and the looking inwards is really questioning your practices. Anyway, so and to get on to your actual question, sorry, Anne.
I welcome your thoughts on all the previous question. And I will say, we did a report on purpose with Blueprint for a Better Business, and we'll certainly include that link with this broadcast when we send it out.
Yes, thank you. And so, I mean, investors and I think that businesses need support on this, and they should be getting more support because, as Brenda says, this is a business issue. It's about creating sustainable businesses in the long term for a more vibrant and sustainable economy. So it's really important for everybody. I think that what investors struggle with at the moment, I mean, there are a number of areas, but they struggle really to compare companies' performance on this compared to each other and across sectors. And I think the lack of standards, particularly in reporting, is a real challenge. So, I mean, one of the things that we at the Impact Investing Institute are really focusing on is the need for, indeed, global standards around reporting of social and environmental outcomes. But I think in the UK, we need to give companies more help to talk about their purpose. So at the moment, I mean, when I was at the FT, when I, as you both know, wrote quite a lot about this, and one of the multinational big FTSE 100 listed company, and it was really trying to embed purpose in what it did. And it found that it was having to report, big multinational, lots of different business lines. It was having to report against 250 different metrics.
Wow.
This is ludicrous, and this is the kind of onerous burden that even good-willed companies are prepared to do, but the laggards perhaps, and those that need a bit of encouragement on that journey, are not going to do that. And number one, we cannot be laying more burdens on companies at the moment, on any organisation at the moment, when all of us are struggling with the desperate consequences, frankly, of the pandemic. And I mean, I think, from the government and regulatory side, it's really support around that. So we believe that, for example, in Britain, there should be a mandatory public interest statement, where businesses talk about their impact, both negative and positive, on their wider stakeholders, so not just their shareholders. I mean, we believe this information is deeply relevant for shareholders because this is about, as we've kept saying, sustainable long-term profit streams, but also that they have to report their actions, both negative and positive, for that wider group of stakeholders. And obviously that is consistent with their new duties under Section 172 of the Companies Act. But companies are really struggling, even the really good-willed ones are struggling with how to do that in a comparable and transparent way that then allows investors to hold them properly to account for it.
Well, you've raised some great points there about the lack of a global standard, and clearly that's one of the barriers. And do feel free, Brenda, also to add to what Sarah said before we turn to some of those barriers in more depth.
Yeah, I think, I mean, Sarah makes a really good point about, reporting and how do we help companies to report on it. But I think even before we get to those standards, we could look to investors, and, in a lot of investors, they've got an ESG team that just focus on reporting on environmental, social, and governance, and they will go and have particular meetings with companies about ESG issues. And then in many of the big fund managers, you've got a separate team that are the fund managers, the day-to-day people that actually make the decisions, and they go in and they ask questions about earnings projections and outlook, etc. One of the things we've been doing, and this is on the gender diversity side, in the 30% Club Investor Group, is working to create a set of questions that you would give to the fund managers to say, put in those ESG questions when you're having the BAU conversations. And also, some of the fund managers have brought the ESG teams together with the fund managers, and they will go and have the meeting with the CEO together, so that there isn't a sense that, oh yeah, those ESG people, they don't actually have any power. They're not going to be taking decisions and things. They're just coming and asking us questions for reporting. We want CEOs and chairs and C-suite execs to feel this is a BAU conversation. We are going to be asked by people about what are we doing, not just on sustainability and climate change, but on actual social issues, on purpose, and on governance. And then I think, importantly as well, the sell side, need to be asking more about this, because really a lot of companies think about their capital markets days and what are the analysts saying? And they kind of live from analysts, commentary to analyst commentary. Well, we need those sell side analysts as well to be asking this and really thinking longer term. So I think those are a couple of things that can really help until we get to those standards that we need to have for reporting.
So that's a great point. It's and I'll come to you in a sec, Sarah. But really, what you're saying is, don't just make it a central core business issue. Make it a central core investor issue, right? Just make it investing as usual. Sarah.
I was just going to say that, I mean, Brenda's emphasis on the questions that you ask, I think, is absolutely critical. I mean, it's not just if you're an individual, a member of the public, for example, we think you should be asking your pension provider, whether that's via your workplace or outside it, are the investments you're making on my behalf, are they consistent with my values and my purpose? We then think that the asset owners, like the pension schemes, for example, need to be saying, are the investments we're making consistent with our commitment really to not just to deliver financial returns, but to deliver a world, frankly, in which we all want to retire in. And then for asset managers and financial advisors, asking clients, what are your sustainability preferences? What do you want in terms of, how do you want your investments to be aligned with your values and your sense of purpose? And to be honest, at the moment, some asset managers and some financial advisors have brilliant answers to those questions, but some of them don't. And of course, under new regulations, coming in, probably the last set of EU regulations that get sent in straight to British law, financial advisors will be required to ask clients about their sustainability preferences. And, we want financial advisors and asset managers to have good answers in turn, to be able to say, okay, we've got this fund, we've got these assets, this is the ESG screen we put on everything. And then we also want to deliver positive benefit. These are some of the things you can invest in that will deliver that positive benefit. And then in turn, for individuals to have the ability to hold their asset managers and their asset owners accountable for that.
So that's great advice. Asking the right questions is absolutely paramount. And that could signal real progress. But both of you have campaigned for a lot of these issues. Sarah, you've written about them. Brenda, you've campaigned for them for a very long time, and you're very aware that there are things that get in the way. Talk us through some of the barriers, behavioral, systemic, and what have you learned from your past efforts that can really help us overcome and move forward this time around? Maybe Brenda, start with you.
Gosh, how long have you got, Anne? Yeah. Sarah and I were talking about this before. I think we've both got some good anecdotes and examples, certainly from the gender diversity side, where, I think a lot of companies and leaders kind of got religion from all of the public pressure and I think the business case around diversity. But even though I think everyone thinks, okay, now that the business case is accepted, you still hear some quite crazy comments. And I think tone from the top is absolutely critical. You know, really believing in it, really prioritizing it. I mean, I had one FTSE CEO say to me, you know, came along to a 30% club session on gender diversity, but said at the end, but you know, Brenda, all the women I know like to stay at home, look after the children and spend their husband's money. So, you know, I'm not sure this is really going to take off. And this is very recent. So, I mean, that's a kind of an extreme anecdote, but there are still, you know, leaders who control some very big companies and big decisions that don't necessarily really believe this. And I think when you think about purpose, you know, you hear about purpose washing. And so I think if companies start to think that this is just about advertising, or it's just about brand, you know, it's not really important, it's not a strategic or a business issue, then I think that's a real barrier. And I will just make a quick plug. The 30% Club did a really interesting report at the end of last year with a number of big FTSE companies called Are You Missing Millions? And it was looking at the case for taking a gender lens, but actually this could be any aspect of inclusion, and seeing it as a strategic commercial imperative and putting it across the whole company. So thinking about you know, your advertising and communications, but your product, your service design, your supply chain, your risk management, you know, how are all these things impacted, and how do you think about this from a commercial standpoint? So, you know, the ultimate goal would be then your inclusion and diversity person wouldn't be sitting 3 layers under the head of HR in a corner, but would actually be a strategic role that has a seat at the top of the house and has a voice with the executive committee. And I think, you know, purpose is very similar. It has to be a BAU discussion that people see as a commercial imperative. But I'll stop there because I could go on about this forever and hand over to Sarah.
Sarah, what are the barriers you see?
Well, Brenda and I were laughing about this beforehand because we were remembering Denise Wilson at the Hampton Alexander Review, which has worked for years now to map progress or lack of it on gender diversity in senior corporate leadership. And she came up with this fantastic list, which was the 10 excuses that came up the most often for why companies didn't have a diverse board or senior leadership team. And some of them were just, you know, very reasonable, but some of them are, you know, we have one woman already on the board, so we're done. It's someone else's turn. Or women don't have the depth of experience to sit on the board. The issues covered are extremely complex.
Well, incredible, right? 2020.
The reason I'm bringing them up is that I think that, you know, and I've really found this in my new job at the Impact Investing Institute, where, you know, talking about broader issues of purpose and diversity. And gender is, you know, gender diversity is a very critical part of the G in ESG, I mean, and diversity in general. And at the moment, I feel perhaps it's not being talked about quite so much, paradoxically, as the E and the S. But I think that what those excuses, funny and unreasonable as they often are, they show that there are 2 types of barriers. I think there are sort of an emotional, psychological, intangible barrier that just stops people engaging. And then there are the practical barriers. And I think the intangible barriers are things around, you know, just feeling this isn't my thing. This isn't for me. This isn't for us. And when I talk, for example, about impact investment to, you know, in my first week in the job, I talked to the pension trustees for one of the FTSE 100's largest DC pension schemes. And their advisor said to me, oh, we don't do impact investment, it's philanthropy. You know, so for some people, that the whole discussion around purpose doesn't feel authentic to them. You know, they've been so focused for so many years on shareholder returns, and they don't understand the way that it's so intimately interlinked with purpose and long-term value. You know, long-term value is about financial returns and purpose. And so I think part of it is about engagement on a really quite a one-to-one level. I mean, Brenda, you'll remember, I mean, BHP Billiton is a fantastic example of a company that committed to a 50-50 gender balance by 2025 target back in, I think it was 2017, really ambitious target for a global mining company, not a sector known for its diversity. And I talked to the woman who was spearheading the campaign there. And number one, as Brenda says, she had the absolute, total, explicit public and private backing of her CEO. And that was critical. But the second thing was that she said it's a lot of conversations. It's a lot of one-to-one conversation. So you have to have the policies in place. You have to have the processes, but you also have to have the engagement that gets people over the intangible as well as the tangible barriers.
Yeah,
I think
that's a great point.
It's that old style thinking, isn't it? I mean, we still have clients that come to us and say, can you do sessions to help us get our senior management on board with the business case for this? And you think, gosh, that's really starting way back. It's not even help us to change. It's help us to get people to understand why we need to.
Yeah.
But I've also found at the FT, one of the things that was very clear to me, that businesses listen most to other businesses. And, one of the things we're trying to do is to show, Brenda's absolutely right. There are people at a really early stage of the conversation on this, but then there are people much further along. And it's partly about showcasing the pioneers and the champions and translating their experience back to people at earlier stages of the conversation.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. We are going to open up for questions shortly, but before we do, and if you have a question, click the YouTube link under the YouTube stream if you're on YouTube. But before we do, just briefly, can you each tell us, what can an individual do? A line manager in a big organization, how can they drive this agenda forward for themselves, for their peers, for their companies? So what are your top tips? Brenda, what do you think?
I think for managers, it's about speaking about this regularly with your team and, asking them the questions and listening. As Sarah said, lots of conversations. So iterating a bit. I think it's not, we can't take it as read that there's been something that's come from on high has filtered down and everyone gets it. The number of companies that I've been in doing sessions with people, and you say, well, what's your purpose? And they say, do we have one? Not even aware of it. Or with one company in one division, they said, oh, but that's for that part of the organization. That doesn't really apply to us. So I think, managers need to have those conversations. I think really understanding individual sense of purpose and really trying to help bridge, your own sense of purpose, connecting that and aligning that with the corporate sense of purpose. Because when you can do that, that's kind of the nirvana. That's really where the magic happens. And I think celebrating successes when you're able to do something that has really helped achieve the purpose and showcasing and role modeling it. I think everybody can do something towards this. It's not just left to senior management, because actually for most of us, the way we experience working for a company is with the people directly around us and the people we report to. So, I think you can say all you want at the top of the house, but if I feel that my direct boss doesn't care about it, then I'm not going to spend much time on it, and it's not going to change how I work. So I think being really clear about, okay, this is our purpose, and this is what it means from a day-to-day basis. As I mentioned earlier, if you're a bank, does it come into your credit committee meeting? If you're, a customer-facing company, does it have an impact on how you deal with your customers, and how quickly you deal with them? And in any business, there should be a way to translate it into, how does it mean that I will do my job today, and what kind of impact and outcome do I want to have? And how does that link back to the corporate strategy?
So there's some great advice there. Sarah, what are your tips here?
Well, I'll just add two very quick things to Brenda's great points. I mean, one is that purpose is a fantastic engagement tool. And if you are a company or a business or an organization indeed that has had the authentic conversation at senior leadership level about your purpose, it's a fantastic way to get your more newer staff or broadly across the organization, people engaged in a really constructive conversation. I mean, I think a lot of us, I mean, diversity and ethnic diversity is a really good example of this. I mean, I expect you to have had the kind of conversation, and I'm sure there are people in the audience who've had the similarly kind of amazing revelatory conversations really that we've had in our team of sharing experience and thought around ethnic diversity in the wake of the Black Lives Matter protests. And I think, you know, purpose is a fantastic engagement tool. So it's a really positive thing that leaders should be talking about with their teams. And then the second thing is, I was speaking this morning to someone who was saying to me about how the financial services industry, both in this country and elsewhere, has recognised that it's struggling to attract and retain the best talent and the best young talent. And the explicit reason for that is that young people coming into the workforce now and then progressing in the workforce, they want to work for a business with purpose. And, you know, I've seen that at the Institute, where we attract the most amazing young people to our work, because they can see it's kind of does what it says on the tin. But I think for all organizations, you know, having an explicit purpose and being, you know, authentically wedded to that being shown in your behavior and the organization's behavior is a fantastic tool for attracting and then retaining the best talent.
Yeah, an imperative. I do want to come to questions if I can, because we could talk about this forever, but I know we've got questions. And we've got a great first question from Luke, which is, do you think that greater diversity in teams will lead to better corporate responsibility for ESG? So, Brenda, you were about to say something. Tell me what you think on that, on Luke's question.
Well, I think it's probably related. I was going to say that at my own company, our purpose is to build trust in society and solve important problems. And it's no accident that the average age is 30, and actually it's just gone up a couple of years. It was younger, and I think, you know, we need to get better on diversity, but we're not bad actually. We're one of the better firms, you know, in that regard, from socioeconomic to gender. We're working on ethnicity. Does it impact, you know, corporate responsibility for ESG? Definitely, because I think our staff hold us to account, and certainly through the recent Black Lives Matters issue, you know, we've seen our chair come out and do a live cast and get very. He was very uncomfortable, but he made himself be comfortable with being uncomfortable and talking about it and listening and having those tough conversations. And some of the work that we're doing and the way that we work is very dictated by that. So I do think having a more diverse staff, you know, gives you the insights and allows you to really think about these things much more. And I think it will hold you to account. If you're just a very homogenous, dominant culture, then, you know, you'll have one view and you probably self-reinforce everyone, and you don't really challenge enough. So that would be my view. But Sarah, I'm sure you've got thoughts on that.
Well, I mean, Brenda, as you know, I mean, there is an increasing body of academic evidence that demonstrates that greater diversity in senior leadership teams is correlated with outperformance, both in terms of public markets or share price performance, but also just in terms of straightforward profitability. And certainly there is, in addition, a growing body of evidence that if you, as a senior management team, take into account ESG issues that are material to your sector. So, for example, that might be, for a mining company, that might be taking measures to improve the environment in which you operate. For a tech company, that might be thinking about your policies around data privacy and hate speech. That if you the more you pay attention to those issues, ESG issues which are material to your sector, the greater outperformance you deliver. And there's some fantastic research that, and we can share with the audience, by Alex Edmonds at LSE on that. So I think, you know, there's a very clear correlation between the fact greater diversity in senior leadership teams delivers better performance, and those companies that think about their ESG impact are those that outperform.
Yep, and that's great. And we will include all those links when we write this up. So I'm going to make my last question here from Jules. He feels that mid and long-term planning has lost focus and business leaders are in shock, just trying to survive and save their company. How can we change this? How can we wake up those who are just trying to survive and make them think about these topics?
Sarah?
I mean, I think that that's such a good point, in that, you know, particularly smaller and medium-sized businesses are just having such a shockingly tough time at the moment. And this is in no way to layer on, and on top of this, you've got to think about ESG and purpose. And I think that, you know, the best that is going to stop us, that is going to increase our resilience to future pandemics and going to stop future pandemics or crises like this cutting such a destructive swathe, is to build back resilience, to build more resilience in our society. And one of the best examples of that is, you know, the idea for the NHS was mooted in 1942 at the height of the Second World War. So, you know, it was a bigger crisis than now. It was a time of chaos when you had absolute uncertainty about the future. And yet there was enough vision to say, this is the kind of arrangement we need for the future that will make us more resilient. And look at the benefits we're reaping at the moment from the NHS. So I think, you know, yes, it is a time of terrible pressure on business, but that doesn't mean that we shouldn't be thinking about how to build back resilience after the crisis is over. And of course, policymakers have a huge responsibility for this.
Mm-hmm. And Brenda, what are your thoughts on that?
I was going to say, I think you're right, Sarah. If you're a small and mid-sized business, it's harder to have the bandwidth for that. And I think businesses are at different stages. So some are just struggling to hang on, and others maybe have a little bit of more luxury to think about how they build back better and come out of the crisis. But for those that have a board, I think that's where the board should come into it, because the executive are dealing with the day-to-day crisis and keeping the show on the road. But that's when, you know, you need to actually rely on board directors who are meant to hold the company's strategy to account and to have the bandwidth to think about the long term, to really to have that time to advise the executive about those long-term issues. So I think there's a lot of responsibility there for both the non-exec directors and the exec directors who are on the board.
So those are great thoughts, and thank you both so much for just some incredible bits of advice. Make it core to your business, ask the right question, build back resilience, and thank you so much, Sarah and Brenda, for joining us. Great to see you both, and thank you for listening. Join me next week, where we're going to hear from businesses hugely challenged in the hospitality sector, just to see how perhaps they're coping with that last question. So thanks very much, everybody, and see you next week. Take care.
Thank you.